Oh, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to start, if you could tell me a little bit about sort of the genesis of this idea and sort of wanting to explore this dynamic that we see in the film.
Well, really, almost more than the dynamic, it was the kind of film that I missed and that I longed for, that I was setting out to try to make, which was a film of intimacy. Mauricio Zacharias, my co-writer, who's back there looking at his phone, and I spent like during the pandemic, there was this sense that we missed something. And one of the things that I was worried about among the thousands during that time was like that the kind of cinema that I loved might not be here when we came back. And that was a cinema of closeness and risk and actors doing things that other people can't do. Also a cinema of desire and beauty and risk. Yeah. So it was almost like a type of film that we set out to make. We then saw the last film of Visconti called The Innocent, and it's a love triangle about a very wealthy, powerful man, his mistress, and his wife, and it's really, really powerful, and the structure is powerful, and so we were inspired by that film to create our own version of this love triangle, and really specifically, we wrote for Franz Rogowski.
I was going to ask, like, where did the characters sort of emerge out of this desire? And specifically, I was going to ask about Tomas, because he is so indelible. And so where did the characters emerge out of this desire? And as you said, wanting to write for Franz?
I had seen Mikkel Haneke's Happy End at the Film Forum, maybe 8 years ago. And if you haven't seen the film, I recommend it. But if you don't want to watch the whole film, I recommend you go to YouTube and say Mikkel Haneke, Franz Rogowski, Chandelier by Sia. Because it's a karaoke performance by Franz Rogowski in that movie, which is just like pure joy and cinema and mess. It's a real mess. And and really that was what got me super turned on. And I thought, I should try to make a film with that guy. And so we wrote this script, and I think Tomas, really what we wanted to do, and I think it was also living under Trump, to be honest, we wanted to establish a man with power and to consider that power. Also, for me personally, I seem to have made a lot of movies about men behaving badly. It's something that I'm familiar with in certain ways, as most men are. And I was interested in that, but I also wanted to begin with him on a pedestal, and I knew pretty early on that I wanted to end with him on the floor. So there's this kind of, that's the story of the film.
What was it like sort of knowing that you had Franz, and what was the reach out process like to get him and make sure he would be the person to do it?
Well, I've written often for actors, and sometimes they make the movie and sometimes they don't. And I prefer when they do, but also it's fine if they don't. Because to be honest, they've inspired the writing. Like they were a muse. And in this case, I sent the script to Franz, but I certainly did not tell him before our conversation that it was like, it's for you. Like there's no... Like I didn't play that card and wisely. If anyone wants to try these things, don't do it. Because it was really like after we got interested that I said, oh, by the way, I wrote the film for you.
Yeah. What was his reaction to that?
I think he was flattered, but I'm not sure I was the first. I mean, and
very talented man.
Yeah, he's a super talented guy, and I think really he understood that this was. He understood what kind of film we wanted to make, and I think each of the actors, Adèle and Ben, they signed on because they thought that they had a chance to do something new and different and kind of transparent. Yeah. Like I don't rehearse with my actors before I start shooting. I block. I spend a lot of time, like 6 or 8 weeks, with my cinematographer, coming up with a visual strategy for the film. Really, I storyboard the film, scene by scene, but we never have traditional rehearsals. I never like to hear the lines from the actors before I start shooting. They've never heard the lines of the other actors. So really, by the first day of shooting is a day of freedom, but it's also a day that failure is always possible, which I think is an important atmosphere.
What was the process of getting Ben and Adèle and sort of building the other ends of this triangle and finding out the right people to play Martin and Agathe?
You know, I keep my eye open for people who perform in a kind of way that I'm attracted to, and a lot of that has to do with the way that they move from silence to language. Like how people get through lines of dialogue is something I take notice of. Ben, I'd first noticed him in Todd Haynes's "I'm Not There," where he played one of many Bob Dylans, and Adèle I saw in a film by Justine Trier called Sybil. And she has a small part, but she's amazing. And I think really I was like, who is that? And we ended up getting to make the film together.
You mentioned wanting to make a film about intimacy, and obviously there's a lot of intimacy. And you've talked in some of the interviews I've read about sort of sex as storytelling. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and talk about sort of establishing that intimacy on screen and how you wanted to depict it.
Well, part of it is in the script, so the actors sort of know what's going on. But really, the first question is, what is your boundary? That I ask. Where do you feel comfortable, and where do you not feel comfortable? And I think once that's stated, there's kind of no other discussion around where they've established a line, and each of them do have a line. What they want to expose and what they don't want to expose, and then there's a process of sort of setting up a situation which is obviously based in trust between them and me, and also with each other. And in a certain way, if it doesn't work out, if nothing happens, there's nothing I can do. So I'm completely at the will of the actor. And if you watch these 3 sex scenes in the film, each one is a story, and the story is not written by me. It's written by these improvisationally brilliant actors. They're telling you like periods and commas and exclamation points. They're moving through things that I can't direct in a certain way. I can only make possible.
Oh, I'm really interested in that. I was wondering if you could talk about, because it is a story and these scenes are a story, but so I was wondering, and you're talking about this improvisation, but where is it sort of written in the script of sort of what these scenes mean, and then where do the actors sort of take hold of it?
Well, I try not to talk about meaning. I mean, really, I try to avoid talking about subtext, and I try to avoid talking about certain things of motivation. And in a way, what has to happen is the actors believe that I have direction, that I'm going to take the story somewhere, and they've seen my work, and also I think they've spent time with me. It's a lot like, I think they think I would be a good therapist also, not because they're telling me about their lives at all, but because they trust that I'm there to kind of be with them as they make discoveries. So it's a very personal thing. I think what I wanted with these scenes is each to be about something different. I think the sex scene in between Franz and Adèle, where they're in bed and Tomas is pleasuring the character of Agathe, was really to me about what happens as much in her kind of passion, but his mesmerized kind of in a situation that was new to him. Yeah. And I think that was really the drama there. In the scene with Martin and Tomas, one of the things that was important to me was that the scene have duration. And I thought, I was inspired by Chantal Akerman's Je tu il elle, which is a film that has a beautiful sex scene between 2 women, and it goes on. And part of what's interesting is it kind of, you go through phases of being with the material and with the actors, and then you kind of remove yourself, and then you're still there. And there's something about that extension which is a kind of puncturing of the rhythm of the film. And I think in a way, scenes like that stay with the audience after they've forgotten the plot, which is really not that important. It's the impact that's important.
I was wondering, you mentioned sort of your desire to have Tomas start sort of on a pedestal and end on a floor. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, shooting that final sequence on the bike, and I mean, how you accomplished it, but also just sort of how you plotted out the visual language of it.
Sure. I'll also just say something about getting him on the floor in the school, which is one of the hardest scenes for I think it probably was the hardest scene for the two actors because it's a very realistic film in lots of ways, unreal in other ways, but in lots of ways. And I really wanted him to get on his knees, and I wanted him to hug her, and I wanted him to end up on the floor. And it was, Franz is a very organic actor, and he had a direction that was like no choice. And also, it was a little bit big for what we were used to doing. And so that one scene, I think there's 18 takes, and he only ended up on the floor once because he really just couldn't find. And then you have it. In terms of the bicycle scene, Franz is an incredibly insane bicyclist, and every time I'd meet him in Paris, he'd like pull up at the bumper and he'd be like, what? He'd be like, whoa, there's Franz Rogowski. And it was very noticeable, and he likes to go fast, and he likes to go like you saw him in the movie. And so I rewrote the end of the film for that fact. And then shooting it was really exhilarating. It was not the hardest thing to shoot, to be honest. We were out in Paris streets from probably 5 to 9, so 4 hours of him writing solidly.
Oh, really? Wow.
I don't think we had a break. So he's physically kind of, a beast. And really what's happening is mostly we're observing him, but then occasionally for the close-ups, he's holding the truck. We're on a truck, and the camera's in the truck, and occasionally he's just kind of like one of those skateboard kids, and he's right by the truck, and that way we could hold a close focus and use that.
I mean, you've been a great depictor of New York, but I was wondering if you could talk about, your relationship to Paris and sort of setting this film in Paris and why you wanted to do that.
Yeah, it's a city that I've known well since I was in my early 20s. It's a city that I've had relationships, I've had breakups, I've had sex, I've cried in Paris a number of times. So it's like a place I feel at home. It's also a city that I really discovered cinema there. I lived there as a student in 1986. I didn't have any friends. I didn't speak French. I went to the movies 2 or 3 times a day, and I saw 197 films in a 3-month period, and my life was different after that. And so my relationship to then specifically to French cinema was one that I kind of embraced making this film. I don't think it's a film of references because it doesn't matter but it's a film of, again, this term pleasure. I took pleasure in the films that matter to me most.
I was wondering if you could talk about, you mentioned sort of you don't rehearse, but there is this, but as we were talking about, there is this sort of intimacy. Do you get the cast together before you shoot? Do you sort of how do you sort of establish that without sort of the idea of rehearsal?
It's artificial, which doesn't mean that they don't like each other, but certain things actors do, they do because they need to. And then I always think it's a little like taking ecstasy. Like they need to get close really fast, and so they make leaps that other of us might take years to get to. And what I tend to do is do something that seems to have worked in many films, is that I set up dates for them often that I then disappear. So for example, when Ben and Franz first met, we met in a cafe in Paris, and we got there and I was introducing them, and then I was like, okay, see you later. and I left them there, and they were probably ended up staying. They thought it was a little bit strange, but actually they ended up talking for a couple of hours, and that begins enough. And then I would say one of the things that happens is that I spend a lot of time working on wardrobe and costumes, and that becomes this really great environment, which I think works like other people find rehearsals work, meaning like I get a few two of them together with the costume designer, myself. We have snacks, and lots of cigarettes are smoking, but not by me. And you kind of try on clothes, and that's like a really great way to get to know each other.
I'd love if you could talk a little bit about sort of establishing the visual language of the costumes for each character. Maybe you could start with Tomas, who does have an incredible sense of style, though I feel like not always the most appropriate sort of outfits for meeting someone's parents.
Well, I'm working with Adèle Exarchopoulos, the costume designer. There was a certain point pretty early on where we realized we had a choice between making a kind of realist cinema and an unreal cinema, and we chose the unreal. So the clothes are not everyday clothes, but somehow with these three people, they kind of look like they're everyday clothes. And I think once I noticed that they could wear incredibly beautiful, colorful, textured things and also show off a lot of skin and look like that's what they do every day, we got a kind of permission to keep going and to try new things. And for me, particularly with Tomas, the clothes become almost a kind of language or a prop that tells stories. So when I considered, for example, like the sequence of when clothes would be used, and I saw this little crop top, which was a woman's top, and I was like, oh, let's try that on Franz. And then once that looked good, and then I realized he could wear that to seduce Ben, and then I was like, oh, but then if he does that, then he's still going to be wearing it when he goes home. So then I realized it transfers and story is told through the clothes. So that was really important. Most of the clothes that Franz wore, he has now in his closet, and he really likes to wear often. Adèle, I would say, for us, there was a moment which was where we had to make a choice between two racks of clothes. One was an elementary school teacher in Paris that you might see in a subway, and the other was for Brigitte Bardot. Yeah. And we went with the Bardot look, which means really to accentuate form and color and the body, but the opposite way of Franz. She's much more, in general, she's much more covered. She's much more about shape than about flesh in a certain way. And Ben, there was a femininity that we were going to. Ben has the one costume which I would say, mostly I don't think about metaphor when I think about costume. I think about color, and I'm interested in color in it and its power. So red, blue, yellow, white, these kind of things. But with Ben, in the last scene when the breakup happens, that's the only really costume where I thought, let's put him in white. Yeah. Because it says something here.
Well, I think we have time for a couple of audience questions if anyone has them. I think we have a mic going around too. I see one right there in the middle.
In the 6 weeks that you prepare with your cinematographer, could you talk a little bit more about that time that you spent on this film?
Sure. It's kind of it is the film. I mean, really, I think that when I make a movie, I make 3 films. I start off and I work with Mauricio, luckily, on 2 blocks away in his apartment. And we write a film which we think is the movie, and we get really serious about that movie. Then we shoot a film, and during production we think, oh, that's the movie. We just shot it. Now we know what the movie is. And actually it's the 3rd film that we make, which is the one we edit, and the only one that exists afterwards, which becomes the movie. So each one has its own integrity in a certain way. What I tend to do, and I did with José de Haye, who's the cinematographer on the film, whose work, for me, specifically her work on Saint Laurent by Bertrand Bonello, and a film called Before I Forget by Jacques Nulot. These are 2 films that I was really struck by. And part of what I was interested in is the way that she sees bodies and form as it moves through space. Like, you don't really see a rectangle, you see a cube, if that makes sense. And that's because she understands depth and she understands lighting. And we talked about lighting specifically, that the bar I set for her and Marianne Lamour, her fantastic gaffer, was every scene should be used as an emotion. And they were like, okay, we're going to try to do that. And they really set out to find the emotion without you noticing in a certain way. And that's the challenge. But then the process of constructing the film is the 2 of us, José and myself, and then a storyboard artist. And we work maybe 3 or 4 hours a day for 5 or 6 weeks. And it's basically a circular process that we're looking at certain films, really studying cinema in a obsessive way, meaning not cinema in general, not like we don't watch a lot of movies. We look at like this scene in this film and we try to figure out language. And that becomes a process where we draw a few things and then we go back and do it again until we find the language that works for us. And for me, it's a language of following. It's the camera follows people instead of actually jumps to the other side. It's often about how people move through space that I'm working with.
I see a question right there.
I like that you talk about them each in their first name and as actors, not as characters. And that's something that I've talked to all three actors about when we finished the film and they watched it. Is that in the film you're watching Tomas and Martin and Agathe, but you're also floating into watching Ben and Franz and Adèle. And I think that's it's on purpose, because in a way what I asked them to do is bring themselves, and then the clothes become this armor which tells story, but really what you're watching is these people, and they can't hide from that. So I think that's why there's this familiarity that grows with the actors themselves. For me, production design is a lot about location and finding locations. I tend to look for locations that have history already in them, because it makes my job easier, because there's detail that has meaning and narrative and conflict almost in the way that walls look or that a stairwell looks. I also have often written scenes that are kind of these things that are kind of often left out in other movies, which is like how people walk in a place or in a car on a way somewhere, or like these kind of intermittent places are, to me, in cinema, they're places where you can actually observe people that like kind of gives you a moment of reverie about what came before and what came after. So I would say one of the things about the film is it's really interior until the end. And part of that bicycle scene is like a returning of the movie and the characters to the city, because it actually then you feel that these people live somewhere. They're not just abstractly doing theater. They're actually in a world that might be yours. The question was about the choice of making Franz a director and how specifically he's finishing this film that he shot, and he talks about after production being an asshole. Yes. My husband's here, Boris Torres, and I don't think I don't go, this isn't what happens in our life, but but I think I do notice that when I get off set, and maybe when I get out of the Q&As, I start talking over everybody as if like whatever I'm saying seems really important. And it's like you have to go, wait a minute, just like shut up. And like, because you get used to people doing what you say. And that's like this odd thing. For me, it only happens like 5 weeks every 3 or 4 years, so it's not very bad. But to me, there was never, and Mauricio, tell me if you feel the same way. For me, there was never a moment he was going to be anything else but a film director. It was just like immediate. That's who this person was. And I think part of it, unlike Chantal Akerman in Je t'ai elle, who stars in the film, or another film that was important to us, Taxi Zoom Clos, a German film made in 1981, starring the director. I can't act. And so, but I'm still interested in exposing myself in a certain way. And so, in a way that I hope is not just exposing myself, but actually sharing some part of my, my experience or who I am in the work. Like I want to be transparent. And so I think that was really, to a great extent, where the idea of the filmmaker came from. And then there is this sense, like, I'm not so interested in labor, but these people exist in a world in which they have jobs, they do things. And so coming to the point of deciding it would be from the last day of the shoot to going off to a film festival, there's like an arc there that's like really strong, but doesn't need much attention. So that was really, I think, why we used that in a certain way.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Ira.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you all so much for coming.